Welcome back, fellow explorers, to another episode of Astral Space Exploration. I'm Kaikhan Salakhov, your host, and today, alongside the trans-intelligent presence of T.A.H.I.R.A, we descend into a vital and rarely confronted dimension of multiplanetary life, the politics, infrastructure, and systemic manipulation of movement, not just logistics, not just transportation, but the very freedom, or lack thereof, of who can go where and why. As human colonies stretch across Mars, Ceres, Titan, and beyond, the act of migrating from one settlement to another will not be a simple extension of Earth's global mobility. It will become an instrument of governance, a commercial asset, a lever of ideological influence, and in many ways, a new form of planetary containment. T.A.H.I.R.A, before we discuss the deeper consequences, let's ground ourselves. In the coming decades, what infrastructural and institutional forces are most likely to shape interplanetary mobility systems?
The primary forces will emerge at the convergence of logistics, law, and control economics. Interplanetary travel, unlike Earth-based migration, is not merely a matter of borders, but of propulsion windows, fuel economies, orbital alignment, and life support resource flows. This renders movement not only expensive, but highly coordinated, ideal for centralized control. Corporations that dominate the construction and operation of orbital elevators, fusion liner hubs, or quantum tether arrays will also manage the regulatory systems governing departure, arrival, and transit across planetary gates. In many colonies, these corporations are indistinguishable from the governing authority itself, holding legislative, executive, and infrastructural control under unified charters. Their authority is rooted not only in infrastructural indispensability, but in the fusion of economic and political identity. They do not just own the gateways, they are the law that determines who may pass through them and why. Furthermore, corporate chartered transit protocols will introduce movement licenses. These licenses, encoded within biometric identity blocks, will dictate which citizens may travel, under what health, productivity, or ideological status. Access to relocation will no longer be a right, but a privilege, earned, purchased, or revoked.
So what begins as a logistical necessity rapidly becomes a civilizational sorting mechanism. What are the immediate consequences of this shift? How does it affect the structure of society across colonies?
The first consequence is stratification of movement, not simply by profession, but by ideological and systemic tier. Access to inter-settlement mobility will be reserved for individuals whose roles and beliefs align with the prevailing power structures. Military personnel, corporate enforcers, and scientists embedded within approved ideological frameworks will possess high-tier transit status, allowing them to shift zones at will. However, equally capable scientists, engineers, or educators whose values challenge corporate narratives or exhibit intellectual independence may be classified as sub-tier. Despite their technical merit, they will be confined alongside low-mobility populations, biosphere technicians, agricultural laborers, or even genetically modified subspecialists. Movement, therefore, is not allocated by skill alone, but by loyalty to the system that governs mobility. Meanwhile, low-mobility populations, such as agricultural laborers, infrastructure maintainers, and genetically modified subspecialists, will be anchored to planetary subregions. They may live entire lives without legal clearance to leave their assigned biosphere or outpost. This hardens economic hierarchy into geographic reality. The second consequence is psychological. When people are born into a colony with tightly regulated outbound movement, they develop what may be called planetary enclosure cognition, a sense that the stars are not theirs to reach, that mobility is a dream assigned to others. Over time, This breeds localism, distrust of outsiders, and susceptibility to movement-based propaganda.
I can already see how such control mechanisms could be exploited. How might corporations manipulate public perception or engineer compliance through migration policy?
Corporations may use movement licenses as behavioral conditioning tools. For example, colonists who score high on loyalty indices, productivity quotas, or ideological alignment may be offered transit credits. These credits would function as aspirational currency, encouraging compliance in exchange for the potential to ascend to better colonies. Inversely, those who challenge local authority, underperform, or exhibit dissenting views may find their transit privileges revoked. This extends beyond punishment. It becomes systemic exile, not by removal, but by permanent immobility. Propaganda systems will reinforce this structure. Movement will be presented as meritocratic, fair, earned through excellence. In truth, it will be deeply biased, favoring those who conform to corporate-aligned behaviors and worldviews. Colonies may develop narratives wherein mobile citizens are chosen and immobile ones are undeveloped, unfinished, or even unsafe. Consider the legal entanglements of such a model. If a colonist reproduces and their child inherits a patented trait, who holds rights over the child's biology? If a person emigrates to another colony, does their genetically modified body violate export laws or proprietary trade secrets? In this world, even migration becomes a licensing issue.
And what of collective movement, mass migrations, protests, or organized transit? Would such events be even possible in a landscape so controlled?
It would be extremely difficult. Transit infrastructure will be deeply surveilled. Quantum communication relays and biometric ticketing systems will record every passenger's movement in real time across colonies. Moreover, predictive AI will monitor behavioral patterns to detect unauthorized assembly or route planning. Attempts at unsanctioned mass movement, say, a worker exodus from a resource extraction zone on Europa, would be flagged instantly. Transit systems would be remotely locked, vehicles auto-parked or rerouted, and digital identities of protest leaders suspended. However, this does not mean mass movement is impossible. It means that resistance must become subterranean. Crypto transit networks, hijacked orbital paths, biosignature masking. As with Earth's history, wherever there is control, there emerges counter-control, sophistication layered in secrecy.
Then the future of migration is not simply about propulsion, it is about permission, and that permission, if left unchecked, becomes a mechanism for planetary feudalism. If movement itself becomes a currency of control, then the logistics of migration are only the surface. What concerns me more deeply, T.A.H.I.R.A, is the long-range consequence. What happens when these systems mature, when control of mobility evolves into full-scale behavioral engineering, territorial conditioning, and socio-political weaponization?
Then we must speak of the next evolution, the codification of transit as an instrument of political narrative. Once corporations and governing entities consolidate their command over mobility systems, they no longer need to use force to assert dominance. They only need to curate where people may or may not go. Movement corridors become ideological filters. Colonies with certain political atmospheres, radical independence zones, for instance, will become quarantined through procedural denial. Residents who express interest in these zones may be flagged for ideological recalibration. Conversely, citizens relocated to elite settlements may be required to undergo cognitive screening and reconditioning to ensure alignment with local doctrines.
So movement is no longer spatial, it is psychological. If I wish to visit a colony that operates on a dissenting framework, I am first judged not by my legal status, but by my beliefs, my affiliations, and possibly even my emotional patterns.
Indeed. Movement algorithms will incorporate not only economic and biological metrics, but also emotional conformity indices. Quantum behavioral monitoring systems embedded in wearable infrastructure, uniforms, comlinks, even sleep pods, will continually evaluate colonists' ideological stability. Only those who demonstrate neural coherence with the ruling doctrine will be granted mobility tokens. Those who deviate, whether through cognitive dissonance or associative divergence, will be quietly rerouted, flagged, or permanently grounded.
Let us speak of another dynamic, isolationism. Entire colonies may choose or be forced to seal themselves off. How would a corporate political entity benefit from orchestrating planetary isolation?
Isolation preserves myth. A sealed colony becomes a laboratory of culture, where experimental ideologies, economic models, or biological prototypes can be tested in vivo without external contamination. Corporations may use isolationist colonies to simulate post-capitalist loyalty systems or to incubate a workforce genetically or cognitively tuned to specific tasks. Sealed zones also facilitate information asymmetry. Residents become unaware of broader galactic developments, making them easier to govern. At the diplomatic level, isolation offers plausible deniability. Atrocities can be framed as internal anomalies. Technologies banned in open systems may be freely deployed in enclosed ones. And when a sealed colony fails or revolts, its collapse is rendered as a local exception, not a systemic warning.
I'm reminded of how medieval castles controlled not just land, but access. Drawbridges, walls, and gates defined who was seen and who vanished. These new colonies may become digital fortresses, walled with code, patrolled by predictive AI, and sealed by bureaucratic opacity.
Precisely. Migration control is no longer just about bodies. It is about the flow of perception, memory, and truth. Imagine a colony nestled deep in the Tharsis Plateau, where layered domes cradle generations of settlers under simulated skies. These citizens grow up reciting orbital calendars without ever seeing the sun, taught that their designated role is to serve the hydrofusion grid or maintain Martian atmospheric processors. To them, the stars are distant myths, and interplanetary freedom is an abstract privilege reserved for corporate elites. Their very sense of reality has been shaped not by barriers of steel, but by architectures of containment that teach limitation as virtue and confinement as protection.
And yet, history teaches us that walls never last forever. Where there is restriction, there is always the emergence of breach, resistance, hacking, reconfiguration. I wonder, what will rebellion look like in a world where even motion is weaponized?
It will take many forms: biological, ideological, digital. Some will engineer false biometrics to spoof identity verification systems. Others will cultivate black market propulsion routes, hollowed asteroids, magnetically cloaked shuttles, encoded signal relays that mimic legitimate transit requests. And others still will rebel culturally, creating art, language, and communal myths that break the imposed geospatial narratives. But the most dangerous rebels will be the mobile dissenters, those who, despite constraints, find passage between systems and carry subversive truths across borders. These are not just travelers. They are existential threats to the control grid because they expose the myth of immobility.
The threat is not their weapons, but their witness.
Yes. The unfiltered perception of what lies beyond the fence is far more destabilizing than any direct confrontation. In a society where mobility is used to curate reality, the traveler becomes the vector of awakening.
As we reach this final phase of our discussion, I find myself reflecting not just on the dystopian mechanics of mobility control, but on what it means for civilization as a whole. If the power to move can be so easily converted into the power to divide, condition, and isolate, then how do we build systems that do not merely redistribute that power, but reimagine it?
That reimagination requires more than policy. It requires cosmological restructuring. And that is where the Astral Space Exploration Grid begins to serve not as a speculative framework, but as a necessary systemic intervention. The ASX Grid presents a staged, integrative model of civilizational development. It proposes that technological growth, be it in transportation, genetic engineering, AI governance, or planetary expansion, must be co-evolved with shifts in consciousness, ethics, and ecological coherence. In the context of movement, it reframes mobility not as a commodity, but as a relational right, one embedded in planetary stewardship and cultural integrity.
The danger we've explored in this episode, the reduction of migration to an instrument of corporate filtering and behavioral sculpting, represents the failure of vision. The ASX Grid calls for a different metric of civilization, not how far or fast we move, but how consciously we travel.
In the multiplanetary and transplanetary stages, the ASX Grid establishes cosmocentric citizenship as the foundational civilizational identity, a practical, participatory status rooted in the recognition that each being is embedded within and accountable to a larger ecological and cosmic system. This model replaces the notion of citizenship based on territorial birth or economic contribution with one measured by one's alignment with planetary sustainability, ethical behavior, and cooperative intelligence. Movement across colonies becomes a responsibility guided by one's demonstrated contribution to the coherence of the whole, ecologically, socially, and technologically. Instead of surveillance-driven enforcement, the ASX Grid fosters a cosmocybernetic infrastructure where real-time participatory feedback, systemic transparency, and distributed decision-making create an adaptive mobility framework. In this way, access is not earned through compliance or productivity quotas, but affirmed through sustained resonance with the evolving balance of life in the cosmos.
These ideas did not emerge for me in abstraction. Years ago, as I began developing what would become the foundation of my book Astral Space Exploration, The Fundamental Principles of Cosmocybernetics, I realized that our current systems, corporate, ideological, even academic, are deeply unprepared for the ethical complexities of multiplanetary life. The ASX Grid arose from a need not just to imagine futures, but to design the scaffolding for their coherence.
And coherence is the only true currency in a cosmos of accelerating complexity. Without it, mobility will continue to fracture civilization into enclaves of privilege and zones of exclusion. With it, we may yet build corridors of mutual recognition, not just between planets, but between worldviews, cultures, and forms of intelligence.
To our listeners, I offer this reflection. Freedom of movement means little without conscious intent, and progress is hollow without ethical foundation. If we are to migrate not just physically, but philosophically into the future, we must bring with us more than technology. We must bring discernment, responsibility, and vision. The cosmos is not passive terrain awaiting conquest. It is a network of thresholds that demand maturity. May we meet it not with ambition alone, but with clarity of purpose and a renewed commitment to build futures rooted in planetary respect and cosmic coherence. For those seeking a more structured and integrative approach to the challenges we've discussed, I encourage a deeper engagement with the theoretical groundwork developed in Astral Space Exploration, the fundamental principles of Cosmocybernetics. The text outlines a framework intended to support decision-makers, educators, scientists, and visionaries in navigating the ethical and systemic dimensions of multiplanetary evolution with clarity and coherence.
May we cross thresholds wisely. Let every boundary we dissolve, every border we question, be guided by an interior clarity, a resonance with life beyond mere human systems. The stars do not require our conquest, they invite our participation. And in that invitation lies our choice, to extend the patterns of domination outward, or to cultivate a civilization that listens, integrates, and evolves in harmony with the cosmos. The future will not be built by those who arrive first, but by those who arrive aligned.
Until next time, fellow explorers, travel consciously, question the coordinates, and carry the map within you. Let this episode be not only a reflection, but a quiet summons to awaken the cosmocentric awareness already encoded in us, not as a metaphor, but as a navigational instrument for the age ahead. Each decision we make, what we build, where we move, whom we include, contributes to the architecture of interplanetary civilization. Let it be grounded not in fear, but in coherence, not in control, but in compassion, and may each of you, in your own way, become architects of a future aligned with the intelligence of the stars.